Good morning. Okay, we're going to make sure. I tend to speak a little bit loud, so I'm going to try and not overpower anyone in terms of speaking into the microphone. Thank you for the lovely introduction, Amadeo, and thank you for putting me on first thing in the morning, because while I get up incredibly early, I usually don't like to interact with people for quite a while. So we'll just remember that the next time we're doing something together. As Amadeo mentioned, I am currently the general manager at YorkNet, and I'll give you a little bit of background about both the company and what we're doing in York Region in just a minute. But I have been working in the field of telecom for over 30 years. I graduated engineering and immediately went to work for Bell Canada, where I spent 6 very lovely years, and then 6 lovely years at a beautiful little company I like to call B&R, not Nortel, because we were B&R back then. And then I left to start my own private consulting firm, which I managed for over 17 years. And as he mentioned, much of the last 15 years of my life have been dedicated to working with communities, working with government to foster broadband connectivity in rural communities, primarily because I do believe that this is the cornerstone of the industrial revolution of the 21st century, but as well because I am a rural resident. I have been for over 20 years, and I have gone through pretty much every variation of possible technology and opportunity within that environment. My home still doesn't have great connectivity, but thankfully the small business my husband operates does, because it was located next to the most massive giant tiger warehouse on the planet. So we were lucky beneficiaries of some infrastructure that went to do that. So this morning, we're going to talk a little bit about what we're doing specifically with YorkNet at York Region, and happy to take any questions on that afterwards. I'm going to talk a little bit about broadband in communities, but really what we're going to talk about is different models, different ways, perspectives to perhaps engage, to help strive to put infrastructure into communities and some of the challenges that exist in that particular domain. We'll talk a little bit about funding models, and then of course about some current funding opportunities your communities or providers may want to pursue in helps of serving your communities. So for those of you not overly familiar with York Region, this is a set of 9 local municipalities that are directly north of City of Toronto. I don't live there anymore, but luckily I grew up in York Region, so I have a lot of familiarity with this whole terrain. I think that one of the largest misconceptions of York Region, very similar to Durham Region, is that these are large, urban, intense areas. The southern component of those municipalities you see, which we call the inverted T, which is Markham, Vaughan, and Richmond Hill, are very urban. These are very dense communities, lots of industry, lots of jobs, lots of transportation, very typical of what you would see almost in the city of Toronto. However, the northern 6, as we like to call them, and predominantly the 4 on the outside, so that's the municipality of King, Georgina, East Gwillimbury, and Richard-Stouffville, are not. There's a vast amount of protected lands in these areas, which always, in all situations, not just here, create difficulties for building infrastructure, but they also inhibit growth. And it's intentional. So what we have is we have an area that can't grow in the number of users, can't grow in the number of businesses, but still want to be able to have the same infrastructure and services that are delivered to their neighbors less than 10 or 15 minutes away. I will note to you that we also have a First Nation within the geographical domain of York Region called Chippewas of Georgina Island First Nation. One of their folks is here with us today because we are doing a project, which I'll mention a little bit with them. So we actually have a vast number of people, but what they will tell you is from the shores of Georgina, the shores of Simcoe, is 45 minutes to downtown Toronto in some days. Not in traffic, but in some days. And we have some of the worst internet that I have seen in Ontario in 15 years. So don't tell me that places like York Region and Durham Region don't have a problem. We have massive problems. However, because we're considered to be in the sphere of Toronto, we pretty much go undetected in terms of opportunities to change that and fulfill it and give our citizens more opportunity. So, as Amadeo mentioned, in 2018, York Region founded a company, and that we're actually a long, complicated, incorporated name. We like to operate as YorkNet. And so YorkNet is a dark fiber company. So what does that mean? Well, technically what it means is we own and operate, we don't own, sorry, we operate and maintain fiber that is owned by the region. So let's be really clear about that for those of you in the room that deal in infrastructure. I don't own the infrastructure. I merely lease it. And then I have control with my company and some advisors on how to share that within the community. So we share that with our own community, being the region, for purposes that serve regional government, which are services that they deliver to our citizens. And as well, we work with our local tier municipalities that you saw to help them with some connectivity issues they may face or with some opportunities they may be looking at. And thirdly, we work with private sector. So much to the chagrin of some people, this is truly open access. We are not concerned with who's using the infrastructure. We're not exclusive. We're there to make sure that, like all public infrastructure, the opportunity to use this to deliver services to the citizens is there for those that want to make those opportunities real. So that is our primary mandate. You just heard it, the threefold. That is our focus. That is what we're predicated on with the region. The region is our sole shareholder, and we do march to a direction that they provide, but we do operate as a separated company known as a municipal services corporation. So this is totally within the bounds of all the legalities, and we do have a particular focus on some government initiatives, but we're not solely based on those government initiatives. So this is a bit of a timeline, just to put things in perspective about how long this has actually been going on. So the region actually started into the fiber game in 2002. Very simple premise. Let's connect two buildings that are literally on the same piece of property, a parking lot apart. Not hard for anyone to understand, pretty simple concept. And then what happened is the same premise started to get used a bit more over the next 9 years. Let's connect a building that's a kilometer away. How do we do that? We get some right of way, we get non-dominant carrier status. So everything was done in the proper modes, but it was done in little piece parts, and it was done with a very simple perspective of just connecting one building to another for administrative purposes. In around the 2009 to 2011 timeframe, it was realized that this could be an asset that could be used for other things, whether that be traffic controllers, whether it be in transit, whether it be for community and health services, paramedics, housing. Any of these opportunities now had access to the fiber, starting from an administrative point of view, but also now, because of the way we manage our internet, they also could get access to the internet all through the region without having to go to a carrier. This made some of the lives a little bit easier. In addition, around the 2011 to 2015 timeframe, an opportunity came up. So the region was doing a couple of different initiatives. There was actually a broadband strategy which was underway to talk to citizens and businesses and get a better perspective about what people needed in their perspective, what they expected in terms of services, and how they thought the future of their corporations and lives might go. But as well, there was activities with companies like Orion. Orion and South Lake Hospital wanted a connection. The hospital was desperate for a connection, actually, to do research. Research in the neonatal unit that would save lives. Research that would actually be deployed as real, actual techniques, not just laboratory. They wanted to be able to take the readout of particular stats on these premature babies and send them to the massive computer that could do the calculations to help them understand what measures need to be taken and what anticipatory conditions might be expected. This was a huge piece of insight, both for the people at the region as well as the people of organizations like the hospital, that this could be achieved. The difference is that it could be achieved through working collaboratively as a set of governments, because at the same time, the private sector couldn't totally meet the needs of providing that connectivity exactly between the two doors that were required. So in this particular aspect, we added another 75 kilometers of fiber to a network that was under probably 100 at the time. So now suddenly, the region has an asset that's 150 kilometers or more in length. Now, post broadband strategy in the 2015 to 2017 era, they decided to formulate a subcommittee, have some engagement with outside industry for over 18 months, looking at a lot of different models and different perspectives, and it was their decision to incorporate a company. And so in 2017, they undertook the steps as council to incorporate the company, establish a structure that they thought was the best starting point, hiring some people, including myself, and then launching the actual company in January 2018. I'm happy to report that the last entry you see on there is 2019, May of 2019. Prior to incorporating the company, just prior, the region actually made an application to the Connect to Innovate program to service some of our most northern remote areas, including Chippewas of Georgina Island First Nation. We were very successful, and we're happy to report that we have undertaken our Connect to Innovate project, and we are working very aggressively to meet the deadline, actually probably to exceed the deadline, and we're very, very happy. And we're very happy about the government's commitment to help rural communities. And why is that? Because rural communities, just like the southern 3 urban communities I have, need the infrastructure. There is no one today who doesn't use infrastructure. And let's be clear, we're not providing service, we provide infrastructure. The services is the area where competition should be unleashed. Infrastructure is not an area where competition should be massively unleashed. I'm not sure, I've traveled the world many times actually, I was fortunate enough, and I'm gonna tell you there aren't many places even today when I read studies and white papers who think that building 2 roads to every home is an intelligent thing. But somehow in this country, with a massive territory to cover and a minimum population, we think that that's the best use of capital dollars because we don't like to collaborate. It's very odd for Canadians, but somehow in this industry, collaboration seems to be a dirty word. And I'm going to tell you that in our books, collaboration is the ultimate word. What we need to do is find a way to collaborate between government, private sector, and the citizen in order to bring this infrastructure to make every life of every citizen in this country better and sustainably better. Part of the issue we've had over the years is the fact that we have repeated funding programs trying to put Band-Aids on issues. The Band-Aids never last because there's no vision to the future. That is part of the issue, and that's why we have to stand back and take a longer, harder look and realize that we are talking about a very large investment. Some of the examples you see up here are Viva infrastructure. Over here on the left-hand side, that's a bus transit system that runs through the corridors of York Region. We work with Viva anywhere where we have to put the infrastructure, we put it in, but when Viva is actually building the transit system, they put the infrastructure in for us, for the region, and then hand it over to us to maintain. All of the buses in this configuration, then when you see these bus stops, are electronically enabled in terms of the whole station runs through a fiber optic cable, and it's actually a system that probably wouldn't have been considered if they'd had to purchase the fiber from a carrier. This is only a system that they interoperate with because we manage the fiber and they're able to build it in as an infrastructure asset and then use it along the way, just like we do with the buses and transportation system. On the far right, you see traffic lights. Traffic controllers, the big secret no one knows. I have a friend that works in the US for one of the leading companies that makes traffic controllers, is that the lights are actually being controlled in most cases, which is actually controlling the traffic flow more than most of us believe when we're stuck in traffic or sitting at a stoplight. So as I said, I live rurally, but in the last 2 years, I spend half my time in York Region, and there's a lot of days I just don't even want to get in my car because I'm fearful of how long it's going to take to get somewhere. We also support public libraries. We have a picture, but we also do our fire stations, our paramedic stations, anything in the public health domain. We're using the technology for a number of things. It sounds like it's all administrative. It's not. There are a lot of things that are already in the category of Internet of Things that we're already supporting, and in our vision in terms of the departments that operate the assets, they're looking at. So our water, our wastewater, our garbage, our transit, our transportation, our community and health services, paramedics, housing units, they're all looking at a various set of options, whether it be building automation, sensors, monitors, cameras. The Internet of Things is not just this explosion that affects private citizens, it affects government. And what government wants to do is use that to deliver better services and efficiencies to the taxpayer. So in order to do that, one of the things they've decided is that owning their own fiber and managing those connections and staying on top of those connections is a better way than paying escalating fees, which are going to explode in terms of exponential connections if they were to actually connect every Internet of Things. Lastly, we also talk about economic development. As I mentioned, we actually do work with private sector. We work with a number of companies today who are using our fiber or working on infrastructure with us to deliver to the citizens. We don't have to do anything to incent them other than opening our doors and offering collaborative opportunities and discussion to make sure that both parties can have a successful end. We provide them infrastructure. We're actually moving to full microconduit infrastructure launching this year, the end of this year, early 2020, where all new infrastructure will only be microconduit. We plan to put in as much of that as we possibly can. So whether it's 7-way pass or 14-way pass, we will have enough infrastructure in the ground to blow fiber for a great many years. And it doesn't have to be our fiber. We're willing to work with anyone in the private sector that wants to open up those paths and service our community and enable our businesses. So you may ask yourself, why is it that we don't have these things? And I'm sure that while I'm sad that I missed yesterday, I'm sure some of these things were projected through you, but as someone who's worked through a number of situations across the country, I can tell you that low household density and difficult terrain make Canada particularly unique in most cases in terms of trying to provide the infrastructure necessary. We do not have the population of other countries. We do not have the small size. So in traveling Europe and seeing great pieces of infrastructure over a decade ago, we have size challenges that impact the revenue. So while the 5 boxes sit there separately, they're really all interconnected. If you have low household density, you're going to have limited revenue. Whether it's our corporation or carriers, everybody has access to limited capital as a response of the function of the finances of their operation and their ability to manage debt. So when these pieces come together, we end up with what I call the perfect storm. Perfect storm of issues that don't allow us to offer equal services and equal infrastructure across the Canadian landscape. This is a problem. This is a problem where we have had programs that recognize this, but to be honest, programs are short-lived and they're competitive, and that creates problems, which I'll address in a few minutes. The reality of the situation is these particular issues leave us in challenging times in the predicament that we're in today. So for some of you, because I know some of the people in the room and some of the communities I've worked with for more than a decade, they're still looking for help. There has been no help. So what are we going to do about that? Amadeo called me and told me he wanted to organize this conference, and I said, that's good, because we don't have enough conversation. We don't have enough conversation between all levels of government, the industry, and the citizens to be able to say, how are we going to deal with this problem? How are we going to overcome these challenges? Because I have news for you, we're not going to challenge terrain. We're pretty much stuck with it as much as we love it. And we're not going to be able to challenge low household density. The reality is we need people living in our rural areas. We want people living in our rural areas. There's a lot of things going on, whether it's agriculture, mining, a variety of large industrial capacities that service this country very well, both in its internal domestic finances and products and services, as well as its exports. So we need to figure out a way to solve this problem before the 2030 deadline so that we can meet the 2030 deadline. Amadeo asked me specifically to talk about some funding models. So my lovely folks in communications have tried to boil this down to a very simple, non-challenging component, and we'd like to divide it into 3 places. Private sector, where I think the quote from the gentleman from Calyx was, fall from the sky. And we wait around as communities listening and engaging sometimes private sector saying, what will you come do for our communities? And 5 years later, we're knocking on their door again going, what can you do for our communities? And 5 years later, we're knocking on the door again, waiting. There's communities here that have waited more than 10 years. And now we've been told we can wait another 10 because we might be at the end of the line. How is that fair to the citizens in those communities trying to struggle through their daily lives, trying to have the same opportunity to engage, communicate, socialize? This isn't just about entertainment, people. We have a small business in a rural component of Eastern Ontario, and we would die without the internet because we do silly things like QuickBooks. Guess what? Cloud-based computing has forced us to require an online connection. We can't do it on our computers isolated any longer. We have to be able to connect to the cloud. We have to fax CRA every month in our business. Guess what? We can't do that electronically anymore. I know that sounds ridiculous, but this connection originally was too slow to do that. We had to abandon it. This is a problem. These are small businesses trying to run their business, trying to do all the different pieces, and these lousy connections, especially the upload speeds, So when you're on a 5x1 DSL connection, you don't get one upload. So you can sit there with your 0.4, 0.6, I don't care what it is, trying to send honest to goodness a text fax for 20 minutes. How is that a good use of time? How is that helping economic vitality and prosperity? All it's doing is piling more issues on the same people who are struggling through every other aspect of their daily lives because connectivity is not there for them, but everyone in the main centers is running their business that reaches them on the premise that they do have connectivity. The middle model is what we like to call public-private partnerships. So we're not overly sworn to the big academic-oriented 3P modeling that you see in great detail. This is really about collaborating between public and private sector. This is about trying to find opportunities that create win-wins. And guess what? Win doesn't mean you always get everything you want. It just means you get something. And it says that on the other side, the other party gets something. And if we can all learn to accept that as a reasonable solution instead of having to come out on top, it's more than likely in efforts like ERN and others, we can find opportunistic models for all the criteria that each party has to try and meet some common goal and some common end. Lastly, there's Build It. This is an area a lot of people don't like to go into because of the issue about limited capital and the way capital is managed. We at the region have decided for our purposes, not as a audacious, motivated competitor, not to go into all the territories around us. This is for our purposes. We're doing this because we honestly are convinced that we will get a long-term return on investment. Here's the thing private sector needs to understand. I work for government. Government's return on investment is not measured in 3 years or 5 years. This is an opportunity. This shouldn't be seen as something that fights against you. You should be coming to us and asking, what can you do to benefit from the fact that we're willing to look at a 20 to 50-year return on investment, not to mention we run managed assets. What does that mean? It means we have to have a financially secure plan to reinstate our assets. That may be something most of you don't know in private sector. That's how government operates. The PSAP funding accounting model requires us to keep continually funding for asset replacement. So because it's owned by the region, because it's the region's asset, we are mandated to follow the exact same accounting rules. So trust me, our plan is built to renew every component. We currently have over 210 kilometers. We're building to over 850. So 850 kilometers around that entire map of York Region that you saw of opportunity, in some cases just empty conduit that you can have and own and manipulate and service your customers with that we're not going to interfere with. So when we talk about private sector, and I did really like the fall from the sky part, I have been collaborating with private sector and consulting to communities who then do the collaboration with private sector. I've worked on funding models. I've worked for federal government, provincial governments, municipal governments. The reality is when we wait for private sector, we wait for them on their timeline. It doesn't matter what they come and say to you. If they're not signing a contractual obligation, they're going to do what's best for the company. And the person standing in front of you may have all good intentions, but I've got news for you. If they're not an executive and they're not a decision maker, they don't hold the end result at the end of the day. We all know, whether we're in government or in small business or in large business, that it's the decision makers that hold the control at the end of the day. So if you're talking to a great community rep who's telling you they're going to come and bring service in the next 3 years, and 3 years from then your mayor is calling up going, where's my service? Don't be shocked. Private sector does not work on a public sector timeline. They don't have an obligation to consider public good. They can say they do, but they don't. And that's the difference. The difference is perspective. Private sector perspective is much, much different. It's about returning equity and shareholder. It's about making sure that there's a return on investment within the timelines and guides that they want. And it's about making sure their business models work. I can tell you many years ago, I did a project with a large carrier who was trying to tell us that the return on the DSL was not going to be high enough. They laid out a schedule for 20 locations they were going to deploy DSL with government funding. They laid out the take-up rate that they showed us. In one of those locations, they blew a 5-year take-up rate in less than 12 months. Think about that. They exceeded, for those of you who know, the shelf and electronic equipment life cycle of a predicted minimum 5 years in less than 12 months. Why is that? because they didn't understand that there's a pent-up, built-up demand for high-quality services in rural areas. And that was over 10 years ago, folks. People were dying for the service. They couldn't get on it fast enough. This is the problem that we face. Private sector doesn't always understand our communities. So as I mentioned, my preference is to collaborate with private sector and public sector, try to create win-win opportunities that are there for everyone. They can take time. First of all, I have news for private sector. It took me a long time to get this, but I've been doing this for a while. Don't expect speed. Government does not move at the pace of private sector. And while that's frustrating on days and problematic for your processes, you have to remember they're accountable to the taxpayer. And I guess what? Every one of us is a taxpayer. So some days we should appreciate the scrutiny, the due diligence, the time to make sure that what's being done is thoughtful, meaningful, and within the context of what's being said. There are many examples of projects like this. As Amadeo mentioned in his introduction, I did work on the Eastern Ontario Regional Network. I have done a lot of work, as I mentioned, I did work in Alberta, I've done work across Ontario, and I've done work with the federal government on several of its earlier broadband funding programs, working both with the ISPs and with the government. And the reality of the situation is that there are different models. There are different ways to make this work. Nothing is really the same. It's very hard. I used to work in competitive intelligence, and it's very hard to say the best practice can be reapplied because every situation is different, and every situation has another factor, despite all the challenges we talked about earlier, whether it's terrain, household density. In the north, people talk about the difficulty, but one of the beauties about the north is you tend to have long distances between communities that are very condensed. All the houses are pretty much located within a small geographic area. In places like Eastern Ontario, Western Ontario, parts of Southern, Northern Ontario, what you have is a huge spread of household density. There isn't a lot of consolidation. We like to call it the spaces between the places. But those people are still in need of the services as much as every other location. So one size fits all doesn't work. We have to look at the whole problem. We have to understand it from both the challenges perspective, the financial challenges perspectives, the outcomes, the longevity, and the long-term financial sustainability. This takes work between both parties. They have to learn to come to understand each other's perspectives, issues, hot points, and that is basically a collaboration, partnership, relationship building, and it takes time. And that's the key we have to understand, is it's going to take time if we want to solve the problem together. But we don't want it to take too much time. Lastly, there's Build It Yourself. I think some of the key current examples really reflect upon local utilities. So in a number of cases where there are still local utilities, or I know when I work in Alberta, co-ops, gas co-ops, a number of those organizations many years ago started taking on, whether it were wireless networks, combination fiber wireless networks, or just fiber, the building of networks. Some have been very successful. Companies like Rhizome Networks out in Stratford been able to come to very early success, been able to attract large businesses, drive opportunity within their small community. But as I mentioned, time is a factor. When you enter the market, just like any other market, even if you consider yourself not a highly competitive player, time is a factor. It's very, very important to understand where the market, the industry, and the current sector are before making your play in terms of going forward. It's also important to understand the context of what you do. So Coquitlam, BC, dark fiber. YorkNet, dark fiber. The City of Calgary currently offers dark fiber. We're about infrastructure. We like to use the same approach as the rest of our infrastructure organizations, whether it be water, wastewater, roads. We try very hard to say we're not really about servicing the end citizen, because there's lots of great companies with lots of great resources who know how to do that very, very well. But sometimes they lack the capital and the ability to build the infrastructure, and we just want to make that happen a little bit sooner than waiting till 2030. Okay, so funding considerations. So what we have here is a set of different components that you have to take into characteristic. So we have the competitive process. So for those of you who haven't applied to a funding program ever, or a municipality wondering how it works with the private sector, it's competitive. What that typically means is there's a lot bigger ask coming from the communities and the country than there is in terms of the coffers that have been set out to run the programs. In the last CTI, Connect to Innovate, the fund was $500 million. If you take the staff costing out of that, something slightly less than 500 million. The total ask submitted was 4.4 billion. To 500 million to 4.4 billion. I like to say we probably have a $3 billion problem in this country. And we still haven't figured out how to close it all, because 1.7 isn't 3. So we have a gap. What does that mean? It means that regardless of who applies, regardless of how great the company or the solution is to solve service an area rather, there's going to be somebody left behind. How do we, as the officials on the government side, go explain to our citizens, you're not important enough, you're not valued enough, you're not as in much dire need as the guy down the way? I can tell you that's a conversation no politician, but also no bureaucrat ever wants to have, but it is a reality. In addition, you need to know about eligibility criteria. So anyone who hasn't come against that one, let's talk about the piece I think was mentioned yesterday, but it makes it complicated. Hexagons. Let's not get into the history of where they come from. That's long and complicated and technical. Let's just talk about hexagons in general. Anybody who's used GIS software, or like me, can find people who can use it, can find out things like, did you know you can run a simple algorithm to divide a hexagon? Did you know that's what we did in ERN? Because we figured out back then that a hexagon was too big. Why? Because we might have a little hamlet down in one corner and 2,500 homes spread across the rest of the area, the spaces between the places. And the hexagon wasn't going to cover it. So we divided them into quarters. Doesn't take very long for your GIS guy to run that on your system. We relabeled them A, B, C, D, and then what we did is ran a comparison against MPAC data. Do you know what you can do with that? You can determine how many rough household properties exist against the actual square kilometers in a hex or in a quarter of a hex. Now that's data. The power behind the data that can be manipulated to help us solve this problem is unbelievable. We do everything in GIS software. We run our entire forecast in GIS software. We manage segments in terms of the build year in GIS software. We're currently converting that into an asset management program for us that will help us with our financials. We run it to figure out where our end customer connection points are going to be. There's a lot of power in these software programs that is mostly hidden with the data people because they're not always the best at communicating it. But I'm going to tell you, you can do a lot. But when somebody says, if one house in the corner of that hexagon is served, everybody is served, I think we have to give our head a shake. I don't think we're that naive. How are we going to solve that problem? That's a huge problem. And it leaves dozens of people and communities and households in the dust, never going to wait, or alternatively, waiting another 10 years. It's 2019, people. 2030 is a long time away. How much economic vitality are we going to throw out the door? How many children are we going to literally confuse and upset their lives? If you talk to my friend from Georgina, what you'll find out is it's an isolated community. You have to get on a boat. They daringly drive across the ice. Beverly, I'm never driving across the ice, I'm going to warn you right now. That's how they get to the mainland. Their internet is horrific. Absolutely and utterly horrific. I know because I've been there. You can't get a decent cell signal of anybody's, because I have everybody's, and their actual fixed wireless, or fixed internet rather, is horrific. They have children living on the island, going to school, and just like all of your children, regardless of what community you live in, they need the internet to do their homework. These poor people have to get into a car and drive no less over the ice, 15, 20 minutes to get to a Tim Hortons. I think if you go to Keswick, you get a McDonald's. Is that what you told me? Yeah, so if you go far enough, a little bit farther, you can get a McDonald's. So their children can do their homework. I'm not talking about university students. I'm not talking about college students. I'm talking K through 8. My 2 kids are in college and university. Everything they do for registration is online. It's a nightmare, by the way, for any of you that haven't hit that. Hey, have you signed up for classes? How do I know? I don't have access, right? So you've got to kind of constantly probe them. The reality is, not only do they live on their devices, the device is their world. This is a plethora of information. My 23-year-old son is probably better educated than my husband and I in a number of topics because he spends days reading, gathering information, throwing certain pieces out as disregarding them, finding others. This is an age that most of us, despite what our education is, can't even imagine, and they're only 23. How is it going to look when they're 33, 43? They've been to foreign countries. They say they get better internet in those countries. They hop around on Wi-Fi. They're not even paying for it. They can figure it out. Guess what? The mother of invention is necessity. But if our kids don't have access to be able to do that, they're not going to be innovators. They're not going to be creators. We already have a problem in this country, STEM-oriented innovation. Innovation to commercialization has been talked about for more than a decade. And yet we're not doing anything collectively to overcome the problem. Eligibility criteria will inhibit all of us, will leave many of us wondering and asking ourselves 10 years from now, when is ours still coming? The rest of those relate to things like eligible expenses and reporting. If you end up in a funding cycle, just make sure you know what those are so you don't get stuck. This is YorkNet's build it model, as we like to call it. So as we mentioned, we build dark fiber, conduit, we will lease it to others, we will work IRU basis, short-term basis. We're not exclusionary, we're not trying to exclude anybody, we're not trying to prohibit, we're not trying to make it difficult. You just have to understand that we also have a board of directors we report to, and we have a financial obligation that we have to report on. So there are issues and concerns that we need to address in terms of figuring out an ultimate end solution that works for both of us. We also do things like co-builds and swaps. So we've done a number of co-builds now, and I can tell you this is one of the best opportunities for all of us. We co-build with our partners. We tell them where we need to go, they tell us where they need to go. We figure out in some cases, okay, it's not the shortest path for us, but they're going to be able to serve citizens, which we like, and we still get what we needed at the end of the day. And guess what? Then we spent less money. They spent less money, we spent less money. It's a great news story. I get to go report to my board that I'm going to spend $3 million less, about 8% less than I originally projected over 10 years on capital. And that's only in 1 year of managing co-builds. This is a huge opportunity, often unseen in this country, that we need to learn how to take better opportunity of. Funding model considerations. So this really talks about going back to what you're doing when you're looking at those funding models. The reality of the situation is it's about risk and control versus benefit. Why are we building it? Not only because we've accepted more risk, we have a lot more control. And by the way, we have a lot more benefit. We can see it very clearly in our future. My team is made up of people mostly not from the industry, and they've figured it out. So if they can figure it out and they've never even worked in telecom and they're just learning the bits and pieces as they go along the way, I would say that there's a lot for the rest of us from the industry to learn and take into consideration. The reality is when we leave it to private sector, if you're one of those communities, fall from the sky, when they're ready, you have no risk, but you also have no control. And the benefit will yet to be seen how that's going to come forward. Funding benefits. Well, certainly it's about supporting for areas that are unattractive for private sector on their own. This is one of the things we found with our co-builds. By lowering the capital cost to our partner, by working very creatively with them, they're very happy, we're very happy. When we have special considerations, areas where there's restrictions, complications, we work to come to a meaningful resolution on those components. And where we have lots of opportunity and availability, we work to find those in terms of how they come out. We provide an opportunity to build. We provide an opportunity for companies to blow their own fiber and break the conduit out and do whatever they want with it. We have no restriction. We follow all the same rules, by the way. Because we're a separate company, even though the region owns the asset, we have an MAA, a municipal access agreement with the region. We have the same kinds of conversations that you have with them. We have the same kinds of right-of-way issues and accessibility issues and road occupancy permits and all the rest of it. We're no different. When we go to build, we face the exact same challenges as a builder. So don't think that because we're government, we're bypassing any of those. We aren't. But if we do it together, we can create a lot more opportunity, as we've just discussed. and put something in the ground that can last for a much longer period of time, so that when somebody does come knocking, maybe in 3 years, 4 years, you can be a lot more prepared to service that. Lastly, about advancing the needs for the future. I have friends that work in high tech. I have colleagues and acquaintances I've known for 30 years that are incredibly successful in their own industries and in telecom. I have a young friend who's a very successful farmer in Eastern Ontario. He's got this wicked tractor thing that drives itself while he sits on his cell phone and manages his business. It's very peculiar, but it works. Connectivity is desperately needed. Our agricultural community will be incredibly more effective and efficient. Our rural components will be effective and efficient. We can monitor our environment. We talk about what's happening up north. We talk about melting polar ice caps. We talk about loss of other activities. With enough sensors and enough connectivity, we can make sure we're monitoring our environment, predicting and doing early intervention. We can't do any of that if we don't have the right connectivity. The current funding options available, I think most of you are aware, CRTC released their next intake based on hexagons. So for those of you, I think I'll step aside and not bother with that particular endeavor. Province of Ontario, I believe Fausto spoke yesterday. I wasn't here, as I mentioned, but we are waiting. We know that they've made their commitment, so we currently await, many of us, I think, for details. I get a lot of my local tiers asking me about that. I keep saying we haven't seen the guidelines, so we can't help advise until we see the guideline and understand it. Connect to Innovate, which I believe is going through some handing out of cash to programs, and hopefully now that the election's over, they'll be looking at either more intakes or more rounds of funding to help people. And of course, the ICIP, for those of you not familiar, not sure there's any opportunities left in Ontario, but the Infrastructure Canada program does allow broadband. So if you're from another province, you should find out what the intake process is. That's usually handled by the province, even though it's a joint fund. And there's definitely broadband eligibility within that particular program. So anybody has the opportunity to take care of that, you might want to look into it. It may be a very opportunistic piece. We like to say the future is bright. We like to say that we believe anything is possible. I have been very impressed with my time at York Region. As I've mentioned, I've known them for almost a decade, but having worked there, I sometimes feel I'm in one of the most innovative sections of government. This particular organization is very dedicated, very committed, works very hard to deliver all the services to citizens. And we're very convinced, the body that supports us at York Region, that we've undertaken a very important and significant step forward in determining our own future. I mentioned that at an AMO conference I spoke at a few years ago, is that I believe communities have the opportunity. Destiny's in our hands. The only thing that inhibits us is fear and money. And money should never be something that inhibits us, and we should all learn to overcome our fears. I keep an article posted in my office. I bring it out sometimes for my board of directors. I'd like to read you this quote. It's from a US publication called The Hill, if anybody's ever read that. I read a lot of US stuff because they're bigger and they do more things. So the quote goes like this: "Build it and they will come. This line has become shorthand for the idea that new infrastructure, once built, attracts customers. But with broadband, the technology that brings high-speed, reliable internet into our homes, schools, farms, and workplaces, the quote may have an unhappy twist. If you don't build it, they won't have a chance." Thank you very much.